everybody, it's Susan. Welcome to my channel, Susan Diamond Paint. February 13th, Devotional, Colossians 1:13 and 14. For he has rescued us from the dominion of darkness and brought us into the kingdom of the Son he loves, in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of sins. Chapter 8, Part 2. One morning while she was seated there, a distinguished visitor arrived. Neil, waiting by the door for the letters he was to take to the post, saw a large, red-whiskered man in a rumpled pongee suit and Panama hat come climbing up the hill. Cyrus Dalzell, president of the Colorado and Utah, who had come over into his private car to inquire for the health of his old friend. Neil warned Mrs. Forrester, and she went to meet the visitor just as he mounted the steps, wiping his face with a red silk bandana. He took both the ladies' hands and exclaimed in a warm, deep voice, "Here she is, looking as fresh as a bride. May I claim an old privilege?" He bent his head and kissed her. "I won't be in your way, Marian," he said as he came into the house, "but I had to see for myself how he does and how you do." Mr. Dalzell shook hands with Neil as he talked. He moved Mrs. Forrester, stopped him to straighten his flowing yellow tie and pull down the back of his wrinkled coat. "It's easy to see that Kitty wasn't with you this morning when you dressed," she laughed. Thank you, my dear. I've got a green porter down there, and he doesn't seem to realize the extent of his duties. No, Kitty wanted to come, but we have two giddy nieces out from Portsmouth visiting us, and she felt she couldn't. I just had my car hitched on the tail of the Burlington Flyer and came myself. Now tell me about Daniel. Was it a stroke?" Mrs. Forrester sat down on the sofa beside him and told him about her husband's illness, while he interrupted with sympathetic questions and comments, taking her hand between his large, soft palms and patting it affectionately. "And now I can go home and tell Kitty that he will soon be as good as ever, and that you look like you were going to lead the ball tonight. You whisper to Daniel that I've got a couple of cases of port down in my car that will build him up faster than anything the doctors can give him. And I've brought along a dozen sherry for a lady that knows a thing or two about wines. And next winter you both are coming out to stay with us at the Springs for a change of air." Mrs. Forrester shook her head gently. "Oh, that, I'm afraid, is a pretty dream, but we'll dream it anyway." Everything about her had brightened since Cyrus Dalzell came up the hill. Even the long garnet earrings beside her cheeks seemed to flash with a deeper color, Neil thought. She was a different woman from the one who sat there writing half an hour ago. Her fingers, as they played on the sleeve of the pongee coat, were light, fluttery as butterfly wings. "No dream at all, my dear. Kitty has arranged everything. You know how quickly she thinks things out. I'm to come for you in my car. We'll get my old porter Jim as a valet for Daniel, and you can just play around and put fresh life into us all. We saw last winter that we couldn't do anything without our Lady Forrester. Nothing came off right without her. If we had a party, we sat down afterward and wondered what in the hell we'd done it for. Oh no, we can't manage without you." Tears flashed in her eyes. "That's very dear of you. It's sweet to be remembered when one is away." In her voice there was the heartbreaking sweetness one sometimes hears in lovely, gentle old songs. Chapter 9. After 3 weeks, the captain was up and around again. He dragged his left foot, and his left arm was uncertain. Though he recovered his speech, it was thick and clouded. Some words he could not pronounce distinctly, slid over them, dropped out a syllable. Therefore, he avoided talking even more than was his habit. The doctor said that unless another brain lesion occurred, he might get on comfortably for some years yet. In August, Neil was going to go to Boston to begin coaching for his entrance examinations at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where he meant to study architecture. He put off bidding the Forresters goodbye until the very next day before he left. His last call was different from any he had ever made there before. Already they began to treat him like a young man. He sat rather stiffly in that parlor where he had been so much at home. The captain was in his big chair in the bay window, in the full glow of the afternoon sun, saying little but very friendly. Mrs. Forrester on the sofa in the shadowy corner of the room talked about Neil's plans and his journey. "Is it true that Mary is going to marry Pusick in the fall?" He asked her. "Who will you get to help you?" "No one for the present. Ben will do all I can't do. Never mind us. We will pass a quiet winter like an old country couple as we are," she said lightly. Neil knew that she faced the winter with terror, but he had never seen her more in command of herself or more the mistress of her own house than now, when she was preparing to become the servant of it. He had the feeling, which he never used to have, that her likeness cost her something. Don't forget us, but don't mope. Make lots of new friends. You'll never be 20 again. Take a chorus girl out to supper, a pretty one, mind. Don't bother about your allowance. If you got into a scrape, we could manage a little check to help you out, couldn't we, Mr. Forster? The captain puffed and looked amused. I think we could, Neil. I think so. Don't get up, my boy. You must stay to dinner. Neil said he couldn't. He hadn't finished packing, and he was leaving on the morning train. Then we must have a little something before you go. Captain Forster rose heavily with the aid of his cane and went into the dining room. He brought back the decanter filled with 3 glasses with ceremony, lifting his glassy paws as always, and blinked. Happy days! Happy days! Echoed Mrs. Forster with her loveliest smile, and every success to Neil. Both the captain and his wife came to the door with him and stood there on the porch together, where he had so often seen them stand to speed the parting guest. He went down the hill, touched and happy. As he passed over the bridge, his spirits suddenly fell. Would that chilling doubt always lie in wait for him down there in the mud where he had thrown his roses one morning? He burned to ask her one question, to get the truth out of her and set his mind at rest. What did she do with all her exquisiteness when she was with a man like Ellinger? Where did she put it away? And having put it away, how could she recover herself and give even him the sense of tempered steel, a blade that can fence with anyone and never break? Part 2. Chapter 10. It was 2 years before Neil Herbert came home again, and when he came, the first acquaintance he met was Ivy Peters. Ivy got on the train at one of the little stations east of Sweetwater. We had been trying a case. As he strolled through the Pullman, he noticed among the passengers a young man in a gray flannel suit with a silk shirt of one shade of blue and a necktie of another. After regarding this urban figure from the rear for a few seconds, Ivy glanced down at his own clothes with gloating satisfaction. It was a hot day in June, but he wore the black felt hat and already-made coat of winter weight he had always affected as a boy. He stepped forward, his hands thrust in his pockets. "Hello, Neil. Thought I couldn't be mistaken." Neil looked up and saw the red, bee-stung face with its 2 permanent dimples smiling down at him in contemptuous jocularity. "Hello, Ivy. I can't be mistaken in you either. Coming home to go into business?" Neil replied that he was coming home only for summer vacation. "Oh, you're not through school yet? I suppose it takes longer to make an architect than it does to make a shyster. Just as well, there's not much building going on in Sweetwater these days. You'll find a good many changes. Won't you sit down?" Neil indicated the neighboring chair. "You're practicing law?" "Yes, along with a few other things. Have to keep more than one iron in the fire to make a living with us. I farm a little on the side. I rent that meadow land on the Forster place. I've drained the old marsh and put it into wheat. My brother John does the work and I boss the job. It's quite profitable. I pay them a good rent and they need it. I doubt if they could get along without it. Their influential friends don't seem to help them out much. Remember all those chesty old boys the captain used to drive about in his Democrat wagon and the ship in barrels of bourbon for? Good deal of bluff about all those old-timers. The panic put them out of the game. The Forsters have come down in the world like the rest. You remember how the old man used to put it over us kids and not let us carry a gun in there? I'm just mean enough to like to shoot along the creek a little better than anywhere else now. There wasn't any harm in the old captain, but he had the delusion of grandeur. He was happier now that he's like the rest of us and don't have to change his shirt every day." Ivy's unblinking greenish eyes rested upon Neil's haberdashery. Neil, however, did not notice this. He knew that Ivy wanted him to show disappointment, and he was determined not to do so. He inquired about the captain's health, pointedly keeping Mrs. Forster's name out of the conversation. "He's only about half there. Seems contented enough. She takes good care of him. I'll say that for her. She seeks consolation, always did, you know. Too much French brandy, but she never neglects him. I don't blame him. Real work comes hard on her." Neil had heard these remarks dully through the buzz of an idea. He felt that Ivy had drained the marsh quite as much to spite him and Mrs. Forster as to reclaim the land. Moreover, he seemed to know that until this moment Ivy himself had not realized how much that consideration weighed with him. He and Ivy had disliked each other from childhood, blindly, instinctively recognizing each other through antipathy, a hostile instincts do. By draining the marsh, Ivy had liberated a few acres of something he hated, though he could not name it, and had asserted his power over the people who he had loved those unproductive meadows for their idleness and silver beauty. After Ivy had gone on into the smoker, Neil sat looking out the windings of the Sweetwater and played with this idea. The Old West had been settled by dreamers, great-hearted adventurers who were unpractical to the point of magnificent, a courteous brotherhood strong in the attack but weak in defense, who could conquer but not hold. Now all the vast territory that they had won was to be at the mercy of men like Ivy Peters, who had never dared anything, never risked anything. They would drink up the mirage, dispel the morning freshness, root out the great brooding spirit of freedom, the generous, easy life of the great landholders. The space to color the priestly carelessness of the pioneer they would destroy and cut up into profitable bits, as the match factory splinters the primeval forest, all the way from the Missouri to the mountains. This generation of shrewd young men trained to petty economies by hard times, and would do exactly what Ivy Peters had done when he drained the Forester Marsh. Chapter 11. The next afternoon, Neil found Captain Forster in the bushy little plot he called his rose garden, seated in a stout hickory chair that could be left out in all weather, his two canes beside him. His attention was fixed upon a red block of Colorado sandstone set on a granite boulder in the middle of the gravel space around which the roses grew. He showed Neil that this was a sundial, and explained it with great pride. Last summer, he said, he set out here a great deal with a square board mounted on a post and marked the length of the shadows by his watch. His friend Cyrus Dalzell, on one of his visits, took this board away and had the diagram exactly copied on sandstone and sent it to him, with the column-like boulder that formed its base. I think it's likely Mr. Dalzell hunted around among the mountains a good many mornings before he found a natural formation like that, said the captain. A pillar, such as they had in the Bible times, is from the Garden of the Gods. Mr. Dalzell had his summer home up there. The captain sat with the soles of his boots together, his legs bowed out. Everything about him seemed to have grown heavier and weaker. His face was fatter and smoother, as if the features were running into each other, as when a wax face melts in the heat. An old Panama hat, burned yellow by the sun, shaded his eyes. His brown hands lay on his knees, their fingers well apart, nerveless. His mustache was the same straw color. Neil remarked to him that it had grown no grayer. The captain touched his cheek with his palm. Mrs. Forster shaved me for a while. She did it very nicely, but I didn't like to have her do it. Now I use one of those safety razors. I can manage if I take my time. The barber comes over once a week. Mrs. Forster is expecting you, Neil. She's down in the grove. She goes down there to rest in the hammock. Neil went around the house to the gate that gave into the grove. From the top of the hill he could see the hammock slung between two cottonwoods and the low glade at the farther end, where he had fallen the time he broken his arm. The slender white figure was still, and as he hurried across the grass he saw that a white garden hat lay over her face. He approached quietly and was just wondering if she was asleep when he heard a soft, delighted laugh, and with quick movement she threw off the lace hat through which she had been watching him. He stepped forward and caught her suspended figure, hammock and all, in his arms. How light and alive she was, like a bird caught in a net. If only he could rescue her and carry her off like this, off of the earth of the sad, inevitable periods, away from age, weariness, adverse fortune. She showed no impatience to be released, but lay laughing up at him with that gleam of something elegantly wild, something fantastic and tantalizing, seemingly so artless, really the most finished artifice. She put her hand under his chin as if he was still a boy. And how handsome he's grown! Isn't the old judge proud of you? He called me up last night and began sputtering. It's only fair to warn you, man, that I've a very handsome boy over here, as if I hadn't known you would be. And now you're a man and have seen the world. Well, what have you found in it? Nothing so as nice as you, Mrs. Forster. Nonsense. You have sweethearts, perhaps. Are they pretty? Why, isn't one enough? One is too many. I want you to have half a dozen, and still save the best for us. One would take everything. If you had her, you would not have come home at all. I wonder if you know how we've looked for you. She took his hand and turned a seal ring about on his little finger absently. Every night for weeks, when the lights of the train came swinging in down below the meadows, I've said to myself, Neil is coming home. There's that to look forward to. She caught herself, as she always did when she found that she was telling too much, and finished in a playful tone. So you see, you mean a great deal to all of us. Did you find Mr. Forster? Oh, yes, I had to stop and look at his sundial. She raised herself on her elbow and lowered her voice. Neil, can you understand it? He isn't childish, as some people say, but he will sit and watch that thing hour after hour. How can anybody like to see time visibly devoured? We are all used to seeing clocks go round, but why does he want to see that shadow creep into that stone? Has he changed much? No. I'm glad you feel so. Now tell me about the Adamses and what George is like. Neil dropped on the turf and sat with his back against a tree trunk, answering her rapid questions and watching her while he talked. Of course she was older. In the brilliant sun of the afternoon one saw that her skin was no longer like white lilacs. It had that ivory tint of gardenias that had just begun to fade. The coil of the blue-black hair seemed more than ever too heavy for her head. There were lines, sometimes strained, about the corners of her mouth that used to not be there. But the astonishing thing was that how these changes could vanish in a moment, be utterly wiped out, in a flash of personality, and one forgot everything about her except herself. And tell me, Neil, do women really smoke after dinner now with the men? Nice women? I shouldn't like that. It's all very well for actresses, but women can't be attractive if they do everything that men do. I think just now it's the fashion for women to make themselves comfortable before anything else. Mrs. Forster glanced at him as if he had said something shocking. Ah, that's just it. The two things don't go together. Athletics and going to college and smoking after dinner, do you like it? Don't men like women to be different from themselves? They used to. Neil laughed. Yes, that was certainly the idea of Mrs. Forster's generation. Uncle Joe says you don't come to see him any more as you used to, Mrs. Forster. He misses it. My dear boy, I haven't been over to town for 6 weeks. I'm always too tired. We have no horse now, and when I do go, I have to walk. That house, nothing is ever done there unless I do it, and nothing ever moves unless I move it. That's why I come down here in the afternoon, to get where I can't see the house. I can't keep it up as it should be kept. I'm not strong enough. Oh, yes, Ben helps me. He sweeps and beats the rugs and washes the windows, but that doesn't get a house very far. Mrs. Forster sat up suddenly and pinned on her white hat. We went all the way to Chicago, Neil, to buy that walnut furniture. Couldn't find anything at home big and heavy enough. If I'd known that one day I'd have to push it about, I wouldn't have been easily satisfied. She rose and shook out her rumpled skirts. They started toward the house, going slowly up the long, grassy undulations between the trees. Don't you miss the marsh? Neil asked suddenly. She glanced away evasively. Not much. I would never had time to go there, and we needed the money it pays us. And you haven't had time to play anymore either, Neil. You must hurry and become a successful man. Your uncle is terribly involved. He has been so careless that he's not much better off than we are. Money is a very important thing. Realize that in the beginning. Face it, and don't be ridiculous in the end like so many of us. They stopped by the gate at the top of the hill and looked back at the green alleys and the sharp shadows and the quivering fans of light that seemed to push the trees farther apart and made Elysian fields underneath them. Mrs. Forster put her white hand with all its rings on Neil's arm. Do you really find a kind of pleasure in coming back to us? That's very unusual, I think. At your age, I wanted to be with the young and gay. It's nice for us, though. She looked at him with her rare smile, one he seldom seen in her face, but always remembered a smile without archness, without gaiety, full of affection and wistfully sad, and the same thing was in her voice when she spoke these quiet words, the quiet suddenness of deep feeling. She turned quickly away. They went through the gate and around the house to where the captain sat watching the sunset glory on his roses. His wife touched his shoulder.